In the last round, we have a very interesting scope to dive into in the near future, which is the relationship Mathias Ungers, Rem Koolhaas, the way they meet, the way they think differently, but in dialogue. This will be explained in 2 lectures. The first one by Erika Mühlthaler. She studied in Berlin, made this wonderful exhibition, and when I saw the exhibition in October last year, we immediately decided to bring it to Eindhoven, if possible. It is possible, and it is nice that she will explain more about her own research and the involvement behind this exhibition. After that will speak Lara Schrijver, who already published on the topic in Ovaska. Lara did study architecture in Delft and did her PhD research here in Eindhoven. We will finish today simply after these lectures, maybe with a short range of questions to the speakers. Maybe we'll end quite abrupt. Maybe we'll end with a final word. We leave this a little bit open to our impressions after the 2 lectures. First, I give the word to Erika Mühlthaler.
Thank you very much, Jos, that you have made it possible to bring the exhibition to Eindhoven, and thank you very much to the TUE for the invitation. Actually, I will not speak so much about the background of the exhibition, but about my research done, which led to the exhibition. And I have to apologize for my English, and I have to read my text. Megaform within the city from OMU to OMA. Nobody can imagine the excitement of discovering 35 years ago the work and thinking of O.M. Ungers. Thus infectious starts Rem Koolhaas' laudatio on his teacher and befriended colleague last year at the opening of the Ungers exhibition Kosmos of Architecture at Mies Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin. Central for Koolhaas' discovery are Ungers' publications, mostly small pamphlets, as we heard during the day. OMU, Oswald Mathias Ungers, and OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture, with his head Rem Koolhaas, are 2 important architects who, according to the current discourse, are connected on vital points in the mental universe. Reflecting on these connections and the related discussion, it's all about the genesis of OMU and OMA, which therefore attract our interest. Which iconographic evolution lies behind their trademark? How related are their works and thoughts, besides the similarity in spelling? Both reflect on the city, its reality and its poetic potential. Both commit their analysis to the continuous process of contemporary modernization of the city. What is OMA? But who is OMU? Is Koolhaas the political strategist, following the orderly advocate of modernity with his convincing player for Megaform? Is Megaform a continual summation for the city as a work of art in the progress of modernization? This study propounds the thesis that Ungers' reflections on Megaform implicitly pave the way for the concept cities within the city. Statements concerning the autonomous object character of form in the city anticipate the literary motive of the island. Berlin as a green archipelago contains the microcosm from which Ungers has drawn in order to formulate his quintessential designs of architecture and urban development and at the end of the 60s. Megaforms in housing formulates the analysis for the following synthesis. It is not far from Megaform within the city to cities within the city. Megaform within the city tries to open further perspectives. The critical analysis and the comparative view of Ungers' text with Koolhaas' bigness may give new impact for integration and a culture of congestion. We've already seen and heard of it. Here we see Köln-Müngersdorf before the house was built, and the Bauwelt we've heard about. 1959, Ungers moved into his first house, designed by his own an urban end-of terrace house in Köln-Müngersdorf. It pragmatically demonstrates the rationalization of the existing as an architectural construction of the urban. And you may recognize what is meant. It is that he is integrating the real existing building in the new one and transform it into some other. Ungers' position stands for an integrative attempt to act as an intermediary between modern paradigms and tradition. At the turning point of urban models, Ungers makes himself to the advocate of Megaform in order to integrate the ideas of the functional city as well as the context in all its facets. Here you see the chronology I did for the catalogue with all the publications done in Berlin and in Cornell and the Summerschools. And today the question arose whether teaching is including the building. Actually, Ungers, you can say Ungers just did one seminar. It was just the Wochenaufgaben. There had been many seminars done after he left, and there had been the 5 diploma classes. There had been his own research, kind of Gutachten Ruhwald and Paderborn. It was paid for it. And there had been guest lectures, and there had been kind of documentations as well. But there's just one publication out of 27 which finally documents a seminar, and it wasn't for a semester, it was for weekly exercises. 5 exercises per week was the same as one semester, so it was very economic. For the development of architecture and urban design in the 20th century, Ungers defined 3 phases which determine the design approach conceptual and methodically. From the stage of ideological confrontation to the coexistence without coherent relations into a current stage of cooperation. In the final analysis, this is independent of the question of greater number, the compelling challenge of the 60s, or the shrinking cities, which is the opposite provocation. For both conditions, Ungers' analysis is fundamental. In his own words, the question is whether new quantities can produce new qualities. Ungers did write this in 1966 when Großformen im Wohnungsbau was published. We see it here, and Ungers dressed up as he became dean in mid of the same year, 66. In terms of the 3rd stage of cooperation, which Ungers aims for, he explains, I quote, "The necessary existence of all the realities such as city, country, automobiles and pedestrians, streets and buildings are appreciated and their interdependence is accepted. The result is a relativation of the criteria. In this regard, every building loses its importance as a self-contained unit, and it becomes defined by its degree of integration with systems of organization, space, traffic, economy, technology, and social life. Ungers' attitude is fully anti-functionalistic. It alternates between rationality and emotionality, and it's purely humanistic. At the age of 53, he commenced his motivation retrospectively. Only gradually did ideas of the position in the existing environment, Einordnung in das Vorhandene, the accentuation of the task, Akzentuierung der Aufgabe, and the conflict with a multi-layered, mature and previously minted environment enter the debate as we had demanded before. He is meaning Gieselmann, Reinhard Gieselmann, with whom he wrote the Manifesto in 1960. Today we know, Ungers says, that it is worthwhile to continue pursuing this approach of a pluralistic type of architecture, in spite of all the misunderstandings and deliberate defamations, unquote. Ungers wrote this in 1978, in a decade after he moved to the United States, a time of productive reflections without constructed projects. During this period of increasing politicization and polarization, he was confronted over and over again, reproachfully, with the inevitable political dimension of scale. As a mediator, Heinrich Klotz was pleading at the same time in the Bauwelt for a better understanding of this reversal in the future. I quote, "We shouldn't just immediately see a fascist axis in the axis of a path, thus not a dictatorial demonstration of power. There could be a completely different reason for a decision, just such as the purely formal one to continue on an already well-trodden path, for example, and thus not respond to the conditions of the city structure idiosyncratically and individually, but as a mediator." Unquote. What we see here, and you may have already recognized it, is the myth behind the front page of Großformen im Wohnungsbau, because the printing wasn't as good as it is today, and I was lucky to work together with Anja Sieber-Albers from the archive in Köln, and we scanned all the originals again for the reprint of the Großformen. We see here that it is a picture of a demonstration, 1966, turned 90 degrees to the left, printed on the front page. During these years, Ungers had more and more contact with Rem Koolhaas, whom he encountered in diverse official contexts. In 1971, in the form of architectural publication about Berlin, 72-73 as Spiritus Rector in Cornell, 73-74 as the architect in at least 2 competitions for Berlin, Landwehrkanal Tiergartenviertel and Vierter Ring Lichterfelde, 75 as a competitor in the Roosevelt Island competition, 77-78 as we already heard in the summer academies for architecture in Berlin, which the photo here is taken. We see, and you already know Ungers quite well, even though he can't be here today. He's the second one from right next to Savade. Yeah. Ungers didn't like the picture dressed up for the festivities, Dean. But I showed it anyway. He does like this one. And it's printed on the invitation card, so I think it's okay. And of course, we transformed the title in a Russian red, as the content was a lecture done in Moscow in 1966, December 1966. Some words to the reprint. You will find an English translation, which is the first one. It's 2 parts we did with the help of Thomas Wensing, and 1 part Ungers did himself, because what is interesting, the VZAO5, the publication of architecture, Veröffentlichung zur Architektur, number 5, is connected to 2 other ones, number 9 and 18. And it's the Gutachten Ruwald and the seminar Ithaca, New York in 67-68. And so it is this typical transformative process, also in thinking. Ungers transforms his thoughts from 66 to 67, when his thoughts about the project Ruwald Park are published. And he adds 2 more chapters. One is on form within the city, and the other the problem of quantity in design. And the 3rd chapter is the content of the VZAO5. And 1 year later, he is doing a seminar with Michael Wegener, his teaching assistant in Cornell. And actually, this seminar, Ithaca, New York, is the experience of Megaform in a teaching context, which is really interesting. And he does write an introduction to this seminar, translating 1 chapter from the thoughts about Ruwald Park. And in the reprint, we put all those texts together and translated. And so you can have a look at it yourself. And the Gutachten Ruwald Park, as I said, is, and as we already heard, is a concept Ungers did 1965. And for me, of course, this could be the starting point of conceptualization of Ungers. It is, yeah, I think very important for himself, and is part of a synthesis of the analysis of Megaform on the way to the cities within the cities. As you see in the picture here, which is part of his analysis, this is the black and white plan, which shows the microcosm of Ungers in Berlin. As here, I think, it's Rüsternallee, it's in West End, like here Ungers lived while he stayed in Berlin. It's just kind of in between the Olympic Stadium and, you say, the Schinkel Pavilion. It's not far from Ruwald Park, which the project is, and not so far from Klinike Park, the Grunewald, and here, with this part here is just in here, and it's all green here. And as you know, it was 1920 when 93 parts, the piecing villages of Berlin, were connected to Groß-Berlin. There had been 93 parts which had been connecting. And it's not only the war which, you know, destroyed a whole. It wasn't a whole. And maybe it never will be. And so the context of West End as well was kind of an island between green and city fragments. And here he analyzes a wall of trees motif which is important for Ungers. There are some building complex or monuments with water towers, industrial complexes as well, and he is speaking about the horizon of the site of Rural Park, and this is his analysis for it. And in some kind, and we can discuss it later, for me, in a graphic way, but not only in this graphic analysis, which always is an intellectual analysis as well. The project Rural Park is connected to the designs of cities within the cities. We see here the structure of West Berlin, and here we already see some islands, and you know, here we see like the metaphoric complexes. And I just added these two pictures to show you what it was. For example, the Friedrichstadt before World War II and today, and to make it much more clear, that was the situation when Ungers arrived. Like, it was devastating, yeah. Currently, we still know little about the reception of Ungers' megaforms in housing, which are Ungers' own English words for his publication on architecture, issue number 5. We don't know which 15 to 20 of Ungers' publication Koolhaas discovered, 1971. Possible number 5 didn't belong to it, nor number 9 or number 18. But maybe it helped that number 18 was in English. The project did in Ithaca, New York. It is 1994, Koolhaas complains the lack of a theory of bigness. Because there is no theory of bigness, we don't know what to do with it, we don't know where to put it, we don't know when to use it, we don't know how to plan it. Big mistakes are our only connection to bigness. He's almost right, and in addition touches the virulent stigma of monumentality. When we speak about the theory of megaform, about formal qualities of bigness, we cannot ignore that the formal is consistently related to the political. Egon Eiermann, under whom Ungers completed his course of study, his diploma, and first practical experience, demonstrated this defensive strategy of avoidance in an exemplary manner in his entry to the Karlsruhe Wilparkstadion. This is not the entry, this is the other one. And Eiermann's design position in this construction project, of course, is expressed against the background of the architectural propaganda of nationalist socialist propaganda with the Berlin Olympic Stadium in the center of the Reichssportfeld, which was so close to Ungers' cosmos as well. I do know that he was thinking about printing the Olympic Stadium in the Großformen, because there is kind of an original map for it, but so he did think about it, but he decided against it, and maybe it wasn't necessary, but it was in his context. So it was also in Eiermann's context. And not even 10 years after 45, Eiermann consciously avoided any form of exaggerated bigness. Also, a considerable additional building cost would have been associated with the proposed embedding of the Tribünengebäude in the site. He wanted just to embed it all, even though they already had built up the site. And he had to, it would have been necessary to reconstruct it all. This is not just interesting from a historical perspective, but also provides new information about Ungers' formative mentors and models. As we compare a second widely influential teacher from Ungers, it becomes understandable that Ungers was also connecting the theme of megaform to an innocent time before 33. It is Otto Ernst Schweitzer, as we heard today. Schweitzer belonged to the Mies van der Rohe generation and impressed Ungers, I quote, as he encountered the narrowness of technical specialization with the theory of architectural megaform, unquote. In the stadium facilities which Schweitzer designed for Nuremberg and Vienna in the late 20s, he created exposed concrete structures which caused his widely known influence. By integrating the traditional and the modern, Schweitzer became an enduring, effective model for Ungers. 1957, Schweitzer published an essay and project collection entitled Die architektonische Großform. Here, a theory of bigness offered a concrete point of contact for Ungers' small encyclopedia, which, barely a decade later, led the discussion about megaform out of the shadows. In the introduction of Schweitzer's Theorie der Großform, Justus Beer stresses that this came completely from the European tradition and was developed with executing European projects, but should go far beyond the realized projects. In this sense, Ungers brought the idea of megaform further, aware of tradition, for the idea of a monumentally of the pure form, as well as for the continuity of the modern. In this way, bigness is considered qualitatively, independently of absolute or relative measurements. By addressing the issue of the historical qualities of bigness, Ungers broadened the intellectual latitude for challenging construction projects of that time. Here we see one of the stadium and the title page of OSE, Otto Ernst Schweitzer, and the stadium as well, and the three publications which may be seen in a line. The VZR05 not only met a very disciplined, arranged and pointed, commentated medley of pictures of international projects from architecture and urban design of the 20th century, but opens beyond that, for the first time, systematically the phenomenological principles of megaform. As Ungers stated in 1966, architecture is defined by two basic elements, function and form. His analysis of house building types, he broke down the theme of his lecture into 7 groups. Streets or bridges and plateaux, walls or blocks and towers, as well as terraces. Subsequent to Le Corbusier's heroic examples, Ungers illustrates 19 projects, 5 of Ungers himself, 2 of the most recent, which were realized at the beginning of the 60s. On the one hand, he contrasts his housing construction in Berlin's Märkisches Viertel. You recognize this, left on the bottom side. He contrasts this one with the plateau concept of the Crystal Heights complex, which Frank Lloyd Wright designed in 1939 for Washington, D.C. In contrast to the general structural plan for the Märkische Viertel, created by other architects, in Wright's project, the integration of diverse components, a hotel with apartments, stores, a theater and a parking garage, plays a central design-defining role. On the other hand, Ungers presents his residential block in Neustadt, Köln, where a footpath is the defining element. Here, a walkway connects a bus stop, a residential home for the elderly, and leads to public facilities, as we see here in his maybe own picture. As well as his own example for a street concept, Ungers presents 2 designs from valued colleagues, Alison and Peter Smithson's Golden Lane project and Otto Ernst Schweitzer's project for a satellite town in Trier, designed 1960. We see it on the right side in the middle. Whereas Ungers was in close contact with his London colleagues, a direct contact to his teacher dated back quite a long way. In 1962, however, one document concerning Schweitzer's research and teaching appeared, from which Ungers took the graphic material for his publication. Well, it is to be emphasized here that this publication of Otto Ernst Schweitzer, we've seen it before with its title, also had an enduring effect on Ungers' work and confirms the influence of OAS on OMU. Schweizer's low-rise residential building concept seems to be the inspiration for part of his design of Grundstück Süd, developed in the same time. We again see the images of Grundstück Süd, maybe the colorful citadel helps to recognize the diverse parts, and maybe you remember this very deep, 30-meter deep construction when you see those patterns. And Schweizer's designs, or one of Schweizer's designs, as we see here on the left side, a page out of his publication for the Trabantenstadt 1960, is more or less literal for a complex consisting of 30 single-family dwellings, which Ungers also presents as a Megaform wall concept in Großformen im Wohnungsbau next to others. In the presentation of these relatively small terraces, Ungers explains that one zone is built on after a minimal fixed interval, and the other, which is situated between two occupied zones, will remain vacant for spontaneous and temporary building work and do-it-yourself architecture. And actually the thing is, this is design 62, published 57, published in the same year. Schweizer's proposal was quite the same, not as deep, totally different in its section, but the principle of do-it-yourself or shell and participating, it's similar. To the question, why Megaform, Ungers finally answers, I quote, Megaform creates the framework, the order and the planned space for an undefined and planned spontaneous process for parasitic architecture. Parasitic architecture contains parts of variables without which any planning remains strict and lifeless. Here, Megaform is an intermediary between autonomous architecture and participatory development, authoritarian and self-determined planning to integrate architectural and social issues. Megaform should organize the city framework. The bigness is not decisive in the sense of the monumental, but in the design quality of the form, the overall view of the physical structure as well as the framework of the city. The contrast of this qualitative definition with the ostensibly purely quantitative derivation of bigness in the work of Rem Koolhaas could not be clearer in this context. For Koolhaas, bigness begins beyond a certain scale. Against the background of the realization of the Eurolil project, bigness appears here as the unavoidable consequence of extra big plans, architecture to the maximum, bigness as a bastion, as an autonomous body and a rival of the city, or in Koolhaas, easily misunderstood, albeit engaging logic, bigness equals urbanism versus architecture. As different as the prerequisites and the consequences of the two are, all the more similar to one another are Ungers and Koolhaas' motives for confronting the problem of bigness. For both of them, the issue is the future of the city. It's about high density and integration in terms of Stadtbau. And I don't have to speak about that. Ungers' reflection to the mechanism of size prove that he concerns to it neither a superficial idealization of artistic means, nor a high-handed glorification of gigantic volumes. Not Babylonian megastructures, but real megaforms are placed in the center of its small encyclopedia. Not the drastic nature of superstudio, nor the desireful naivety of archicam does fit in Ungers' concrete conception of a modern civilian society, in which a successful realization of urban modernization is dependent on the degree of integration into larger fields, technical, economic, organizational, and spatial kind. With his resolution to accept and convert productively the necessary evils of modernization, Ungers becomes the pioneer of an adventurous generation of architects to which also Rem Koolhaas belongs. Sorry. At the end of 1994, Rem Koolhaas affirmed in connection with the opening of his exhibition Oma et MoMA, Rem Koolhaas and the Place of Public Architecture, his aims by deepest conviction are urban. More and more the city is all we have. In search for a theory of bigness, Koolhaas varies between opposite attitudes. Unconcerned America versus moralizing West. Manhattanism versus European city. Delirious New York versus Steinerness Berlin. His point of view for the problem of the size seems to be undecided. I quote, "Through size alone, such buildings enter an amoral domain, beyond good or bad. Their impact is independent of their quality." Beyond good or bad, Koolhaas announces a third category, independently of qualitative scales, pure quantity, actual size. While size was certain for so far as ethical moral term by a controlled dimension, a calculable measure, a detectable effect, Koolhaas then observed an immoral increase beyond a certain scale. The critic, Richard Vine, circulated the schizoid character of the exhibited contributions, a confusing amalgam of greatness and desperation. While the texts such as bigness deny the omnipotence, the models demonstrate the hybris of the architect. One of the exhibited large-scale projects is the C-terminal Zeebrugge, a significant megaform and a colossal hybrid out of different programs, shapes, and materials. Sought as a Tower of Babel without tears, which reflects the new ambition of Europe, this machine proclaims a working Babel that effortlessly swallows, entertains, and processes the traveling masses. Optimistically, it inverts the symbolism of Babel into its opposite, upside down and the other way around. It could have become a festive monument to free mobility in a united Europe. As a road sign, it stands proverbially for Ungers' preliminary design strategy, which turns not only common perceptions upside down. Koolhaas cultivates freshness, turning the whirl of contradictions into its opposite, into its positive opposite. The ferry terminal reproduced it in its complexity and urban design vision in miniature. Motopia, a book about a motorized city utopia, a city of bridges, created 1961 by the English town planner Geoffrey Jellicoe. I quote, "Motopia is the diagram of an idea only and should not be taken literally." This is a mistake we often do today. Either in regard to its site, which is in the green belt around London, or in the severity of its geometry, which should be complex. Motopia is also part of Ungers' Großformen im Wohnungsbau. It illustrates the pleasant vision of connecting city, car, and nature. Here, conventions are also turned upside down when a wide-ranging network of overhead freeways forms the roof of a construction development, which should contain public car-free green spaces and constitute an idyllic living environment. Ungers' successful and unfortunately unrealized theatre ring project gains a special significance due to Koolhaas' involvement. In 1974, Ungers offered a very colorful array of pictures of designs of dwelling types. On the one hand, the conception refers to Grünzug Süd. On the other hand, it continues the rationalization of the existing streets for cars and pedestrians on the ground as well as inside or on top of the buildings. I'm sorry, it's not the right picture. Just take this one. This transforms Ungers' concept of the superstructure of a freeway into a Berlin Motopia, which might also have been influenced by Koolhaas. A surprising point of the story is, and now I have to go backwards, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. So there's a surprising point of the story of Koolhaas' design of a European traffic center is the fact that the analysis, you may know it, it's out of SML XL, we see it on the left side, that the analysis for the Seebrugge competition project were based in Ungers' sphere of influence. It is Professor Dr. Michael Wegener, Ungers' assistant for the testing of Megaform solution in a Cornell seminar in 1967, whose research became a carrier for Ungers' legacy. His new time-space maps of Europe illustrate the shrinking continent and work directly as reference for Koolhaas' design of an European traffic center. For Koolhaas, as little as for Ungers, bigness follows a purpose of its own, but when inverted in a positive way, it is a means of implementing the desired urban development and its related goals as complex traffic intersections or gigantic consumer worlds. What connects these genial characters who both, in their own way, are a means of reflecting the spectrum of their time? Does Koolhaas synthesize the systematic order of the rationalist with the playful gesture of the I did train it, I don't situationist, I don't know. Does he thus realize the adventure of modernity? I start again, the sentence is too important. Does Koolhaas synthesize the systematic order of the rationalist with the playful gesture of the situationist? Does he thus realize the adventure of modernity for whose objectives Ungers has also assumed responsibility? With their dissecting analysis of apparent paradoxes, OMU and OMA create explanatory embodiments of contemporary oxymorons in the framework of their thought experiments. Each one of them is an unfettered pioneer, an adventure of the acquiring spirit, which are all quotes done by themselves, and 100% identification with the pragmatic adventure of the modern world. A statement of faith in modern everyday life in the laboratory of the city, in which the limits of the individual and collective freedom must be explored, political and informal, and, much more importantly, must be moderated and produced. For both of them, the noble duties of an architect include the combination of the necessary with the useful for the common good, without losing its own authority and architecture's autonomy. Already 1963, and now I just stepped through some pictures. This one is Fittering as well, and you are lucky you can have a look on Fittering in the exhibition. Now you do know how important it is, as I think, as well as some others. Already in 1963, Ungers refers to the socialist Hans Paul Barth, who published in his Reflections zur modernen Großstadt, done 1961. Barth encourages for the realization of as much utopian as possible. Little utopias, you may say, like Megaform. For Ungers, Barth's central statement is that the urban landscape is defined by the polarization of the public and the private. And this is all the greater, the more pronounced this polarity and the interplay between these two spheres are. In this sense, Ungers sees his task as the clear and clearing delineation of spatial conception for the creation of urban landscapes, which is defined similarly in Koolhaas' projects, however, increasingly oriented towards the inside. Like Ungers himself, Koolhaas also acts as an ethic moral authority in the Christian moralizing consciousness of the Western tradition. Ostensibly, neither one of them is subject to the fascination of self-indulgence, but would like to create public architectural spaces. They use order as bigness to establish ordinance. Contrary to Ungers, Koolhaas frees himself from aesthetic conventions. Not abstract beauty unlock magnificent discoveries which are dependent on the context. Not exaggerated bigness, not gigantic mass, but the mastery in form of unlashed quantity and urban quality. Koolhaas speaks warningly of bigness as pure quantity and implicitly preaches that megaform is a formative strength of new urbanity. In 1966, in his Moscow lecture, Ungers presented 3 historic megaform projects. Next to a well-fortified garrison city depicted by Albrecht Dürer, he also showed the Tower of Babel. Ungers demonized the gigantic striving for power and the outrageous ambition of Babylonian emblems and hopes for the realization of utopian arrangements in a structural form of an ideal city, embodied in the 3rd megaform example, Thomas More's Utopia. The motive of a Utopia insulae figura, engraved on More's title page, becomes the promise of an allegedly better world. The image of the island, Thomas More's utopian model for an ideal city, inspires Ungers for a long time and will find its own synthesis 10 years later in the formulation of the Green Archipelago, with Berlin as the main figure between a destroyed Babel and a heavenly Utopia. Thank you.
Om hier te blijven staan. Thank you. Thank you, Jos, also for inviting me. This previous presentation poses me with a problem because a lot of the work I've done, in fact, for the article that Jos referred to that I published was so well explained that I don't really need to go through much of this work. So what I actually want to do, to keep it short because it's the end of the day, I would like to, as briefly as possible, outline why I think the ideas of Ungers and the ideas of Koolhaas are so resonant with one another, what I think that may contribute to a contemporary architectural discussion, and summarize that as well as I can, as clearly as I can, and then move on to a slightly more risky position, which is work that I'm working on now. And work that one is working on now is always still in progress and therefore a little difficult to explain, or at least to make quite as clear as the earlier. To begin with what I've already done, Erika just suggested that Ungers and Koolhaas are by now accepted as very much related, but as recently as our Charles Jenks modern movements, they were divided by this enormous white gap and classical revivalism. Interesting position, but if we take Jenks as a starting point, the difference between these two, where Ungers is hopelessly lodged between the postmodern and rationalism, with a tiny hint towards the city under it, and Koolhaas, as much as he would dislike this categorization, is centered firmly under deconstruction and the idea of the generic. I think actually connecting these two and explicating some of their basic concepts that they share during a time when they were working together clarifies, in fact, how outdated by now this white gap between the two is. Most of this centers on exactly that publication, The City Within the City, Die Stadt in der Stadt. That's a 1977 publication that I have been working from. And I think to understand where the two paths of Ungers and Koolhaas cross, we basically need to look at four concepts. There's the city within the city, a precursor to the city within the city in Megaform, which was fortunately explained beautifully by the previous slides. I tend to hold towards the German name Großform, despite Ungers' own translation of Megaform, because it feels like Megaform relates so closely to megastructure that it's easy to conflate the two. Those are the first two concepts, and then the city of the captive globe by Koolhaas, and bigness, of course, as the next step. Now, the city within the city, as we've just seen in these maps that have already been shown more than once today, the map of the city itself becomes an underlay for extending, say, the definition of these spaces that are then labeled as entirely coherent cities within a city. This is because it continues on the idea of Großform. Großform, of course, is a notion that has such a formal coherence that it is no longer about scale, and Ungers does stipulate this very specifically. Großform is not about scale. Even an individual house may be a Großform, given that its formal coherence and its formal power, its strength, is so fundamental that it is undeniably a rigorously ordering structure within the city. As Großform becomes extended towards the urban domain, towards the urban condition, they begin in Stadt in der Stadt to isolate areas that may become so fundamentally strong, powerful, as perhaps a Großform, but in fact a slightly larger collective space of that, and that then become these almost idyllic little images that expand on how self-enclosed these elements are. Now, why is this interesting today? This is interesting because we have a problem, I think, in contemporary architecture of the position of architecture within the city, and most specifically where this public space and the private space find their domains. Ungers and Koolhaas both have a very deep interest in the idea of the collective. And the collective, I think, in both their work is defined on a little more complex level than merely the position between the public and the private. They find these spaces, the city within the city, where the collective can become an answer to the problems of urban planning in the 1960s, where the ideas proposed for the city always continue to treat the city as a unified whole. And if we want to really consider one shift, perhaps, that the two have sort of completed from the early work of Ungers to the early work of Koolhaas, which does span about 15 years, if there is one major shift that they can be considered exemplary for, it would have to be the shift from the city as a unified whole to the city that is so embedded with various pluralities and various heterogeneous spaces that nevertheless still construct a whole. We'll return to that because it's actually an interesting concept that they've offered, which is very much lodged in the work of Ungers. The images that produce the city within the city always emphasize these momentary fragments that are, however, very strong in geometry, strong in form. Again, in the black and white plans, again, in the geometries, as you see in the isometric top right, the clarity of these individual units that always emphasize these individual moments and the coherence of a tiny little universe within the city. These, of course, obviously beg the reference to the city of the captive globe, as Koolhaas defines the grid in Manhattan being so strong that each individual space is allowed the option for maximum freedom. Again, it is the framework that ends up allowing all the freedom to expand. Now, how is this even possible? I suppose to understand that, we need to return almost to Schinkel's Glienicke, because this is the moment where Ungers proposes that the fundamental understanding of plurality that leads to unity has everything to do with Nicolaas von Cuse's coincidentia oppositorum, the idea that by opposing the many, by setting together absolutely oppositional conditions, we enter a moment that we might almost consider the sublime. It's the crash of the one heterogeneity against the other that allows us to enter something more than we can actually understand, than we can actually feel by treating something as a single unified whole. It's kind of difficult actually to present this because so many of these things have come back today that it becomes almost impossible to not go over ground we've already gone over, and yet remain within what I would like to clarify. The strongest indications, I guess, of the importance of the ideas and the resonance between the work of Ungers and Koolhaas are all lodged roughly between 69 and 78. We might even say 71 and 78. 71 is the moment where Koolhaas puts in for his scholarship, a Harkness Fellowship to Cornell, to join the school under the teaching of Ungers. And 78 is the moment he publishes Delirious New York. Delirious New York has the City of the Captive Globe in it. City of the Captive Globe, however, is already developed by 1972 and republished again by 1975. So it's in this short 7-year span that I think a number of these ideas are both reiterated, developed, and resonating with one another to strengthen the ideas. And Grossform, I think we can consider a precursor to that in about 1966. Now, New Welfare Island, 1975, as has been shown today, this is a moment where there are two different competition entries, one by OMA and one by Ungers, where Ungers really specifically designs the city within the city, as Ovaska showed today. Koolhaas is actually, in an odd sort of way, proposing these Grossforms that delineate New Welfare Island. I'm actually going to skip over this since we saw this, the city within the city again for Welfare Island. Lichtervelde is the easiest connection, in fact, from the City of the Captive Globe to why we would move on towards bigness. because bigness and Lichterfelde, let's just stay with that one. Lichterfelde has these kind of zones of delineation that become these exact kind of cities within the city. They are so powerfully their own character. They are so specific to themselves, and they are set next to one another in absolute contradiction or in absolute opposition, yet the entire continuum becomes something larger than the thing itself, which is referred to in Delirious New York from a cartoon in Life magazine, the 1909 theorem, which is related again to the idea of the vertical schism. Vertical schism and the city of the captive globe, both quite the same thing. The idea that you can stack very specific personal, almost personal utopias, stack little personal universes one upon the other, and that their confrontation does not destroy one another, but in fact reinforces one another. Now, having said all of this, just to put it in a perspective, this morning we saw that Ungers was positioned between Team 10 and rationalism. I would actually tend to say more that Ungers and Koolhaas are positioned between the 1960s as potentially exemplified by Team 10 and contemporary urban architectural thinking in terms of a pluralistic society. Both Ungers and Koolhaas maintain the idea that pluralism should be explored, pluralism should be celebrated, and pluralism should be embodied, in fact, by allowing these absolute collectives to sit next to one another within the city and to say, celebrate their own identity, in a sense. For both of them then, these Großforms, or these cities within the city, form a new collective. They form the idea that it is possible to design a city that allows the different characters for a heterogeneous population to exist without one needing to dominate the other. And I think on that level, we can see Koolhaas's work as very clearly reacting against the political and sociological utopias of the 1960s. And Ungers himself, in fact, mentions this numerous times. One of the specific comments that he always makes about his work is that architecture cannot be reflected through through sociology. It cannot be reflected through the political. It must be reflected through the discipline in and of itself. His big issue in the 1960s in Berlin, of course, was that the students were working on the political and they were not quite ready for the architectural on that level. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that what are we struggling with today? We're struggling with an unbelievably complex society. We're struggling with cities that have grown beyond every kind of comprehension that we can possibly imagine. And Koolhaas has entered this field of debate very explicitly with the notion of bigness. And this notion of bigness exactly goes on to quantity. But for him, the quantity does not entirely negate quality. Bigness may negate all traditional forms of architectural design and architectural tools that we have, but the quantity of bigness in and of itself becomes a new quality. And that new quality is the potential to reinvent the collective, as he literally says in the article. It means that the collective can no longer perhaps be settled within cities within the city, yet the quality of bigness as such will necessitate that we rethink what the collective is. And this is demanding. This is a demanding condition. I think if we find one point of resonance between the two as character, they are both extremely demanding, be it the purism of the white cube in Ungers or the absolute architecture of Koolhaas's fetish for the Berlin Wall, or the idea that our new collective will demand a new person. I think those are the crucial issues that we're still trying to sift through today. Now, what I would actually like to propose now, and this is the part of the work in progress, is that all of this, all of these ideas about the potential forming of a collective, the possibility of accommodating a society with plural collectives, is not to be found in the sociological debate of the 1960s, but is firmly lodged within form. And with Ungers, this is obvious. He explains grootvorm as a condition of form. He explains the city within the city as a condition of formal coherence. He explains the coincidentia oppositorum as formal conditions. He also explains city metaphors from the Cooper-Hewitt exhibition, Man Transforms, as something that is, again, form. Because to him, form is our understanding of the world. It is a way that we perceive, it is a way that we interpret. We need images, we need analogies, we need signs, we need symbols, we need metaphors. The small space that I'm going to go out on a limb here, though, is that Koolhaas does exactly that. He always writes in his work about programmatic instability. He always discusses conditions. He discusses the urban. He discusses bigness as a regime of complexity. He says that we no longer have architectural tools to address this. Yet, I think if we question these concepts, these fundamental concepts of a contemporary pluralist society that is lodged from grootvorm to city within the city to bigness, if we question those concepts and how they have found their way into the early work of Koolhaas, it's almost undeniable when examined through the eye here of Ungers that form is a very important concern for Koolhaas, fundamental though not explicit. This publication I just want to show a few images of because Ungers tries to explicate this very fundamental idea about metaphors and analogies and city and morphology, or the city metaphor, through a juxtaposition of three elements. He has the plan on the left, he has an associative corresponding image on the right, and he has a word, a caption, that to him defines the concept at the bottom. And to him, by offering up this work that shows us the plan, the image, and the concept, he is starting to create a new space where we can think of the idea of form as something that is not geometry, that is not simple, that is not separated from its content, but that is one holistic, gestalt-based, in fact, universe that will inevitably trigger the very basis of people's thinking. One of my personal favorites is really difficult to deny. Now, as I said, I'm going out on a little bit of a limb because Koolhaas does not discuss form, and in fact, when interviewed, he tries to avoid it as much as possible, and his partner in crime at the time, Elias Ingelis, accuses themselves of having forgotten form in favor of the program, but I'm not entirely sure that's correct. The project Exodus, done in 1972 by Koolhaas, seems to indicate a very strong affinity for the ideas of the city within the city, as well as a very strong affinity for the extreme formal position that Ungers sometimes takes in his designs. The linear city, in obvious references to the Russian constructivists that Rem was always so fascinated with, but also the spaces within that. He has, each one of these are their own little city within the city. Each square, again the square, is its own city within the city that is an entirely self-sufficient universe on a conceptual level. Most of these spaces are, again, collective spaces. We're always looking for the collective and not the individual. The baths, as drawn by Koolhaas, with their individual boxes that nevertheless create mini collectives within their baths, within their bathing experience. And that in heavy contrast with the individual allotments where apparently people may retire to their everyday musings for a brief period of time, as Koolhaas says, to revive from the demands of the continuous collective experience. Again here, if we consider this in reflection on the city within the city, the idea that you would have these really charged, formal, heavy, Großform-like fields that are an intense experience, and those, in fact, exacerbate the contrast between them and the almost banal kind of nothingness field of these individual allotments is visible as early as this project. The project itself, done at the AA, has, especially in this image, an obvious reference to Superstudio's continuous monument. And again there, it is important to see that it is about these collisions. And that's why I want to bring back the city within the city for a moment. This one is not about finding a unified whole in the city. It is about tiny, momentary, I would almost say utopias, that are defiant in the face of a field around itself that is pretty much close to nothing. And in that defiance is exactly how they can find the collective. It is exactly how we can find a space for us to navigate the impossible complexity of the contemporary city that keeps us tossing between the private and the public. And finally, as a quick, I suppose, gesture towards both Ungers and Koolhaas in this final image, you can see under the range of bookcases a miniature of the Exodus project, which supposedly will be recreated every so often as the Exodus itself changes, and the ultimate kind of doll within a doll, or a house within a house, an Exodus within the Exodus, and the city within the city, as a space for us to redefine what it actually means to be a collective individual or a pluralist individual within a society that is as heterogeneous as we've had. The idea that perhaps there is hope for us yet, the idea that despite the 1960s failure of a larger utopia, the idea that perhaps in fact it is within that individualized collective that we might find a balance between the perfected machine utopia and the idealized individual that I think the situationists at the time were hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful idea just to plan the two lectures and stop. I think the last lecture really not only finished this day in a beautiful way, but also opened a perspective for the research that you are doing. I mean, you opened the window into your room. In a way, I have the impression that what you explained about metaphors in a beautiful way also explained what Hans Kollhoff tried to explain this morning, about what he thought was so interesting about Kollhoff, about Ungers, in the way it meant for him, in the way of thinking. I mean, this thinking in images. What Erika explained was another way of linking back much further in the history, not only of the line of thinking of Ungers, but also what I tried to explain at the beginning, that in the time period a lot of ideas were rediscovered. What megaform means for Ungers is probably very different from a Schweitzer, but Schweitzer, by bringing back what you brought back, explains a lot why Habraken and that kind of architects are interested in form and the way people use these forms. And so we opened a lot of chapters, and I'm not only very happy with this, but also with the idea to come back one time, maybe in a smaller space, to digest the last round, to invite Niklas Kuhner, then to have with Bernhard Kohlebrander and him a kind of discussion what this all has brought us so far. Because it's a wonderful contemporary look into what we have discussed for the whole day, but also what is now coming up in the magazines. I want to finish with books. The reprint of Großformen I announced at the beginning of the day that it would be next to the coffee, which is not true. All those of you who have a coat may have noticed that the books are near the coat room, so here around the corner. It means that we have had a lot of memories about Ungers today, but you all can also take home your souvenirs. There are postcards, there are books, there are the catalogs of the exhibition, and I want to finish with a book we have done today, Learning by OMU, but it's also Learned from OMU, which I want to offer to Sophia Ungers as a way to finish this day. Of course, we have drinks now, and thank you all for coming. Thank the team, Rob van Wendel, Mieke Verschoor, and Stijn Holdernat. Thank you for joining this Fortune Day. Jan Lester announced there will be 3 more. The large one will be in December. Fritz Neumeier, who could not be here today because he was operated, will probably be interested to be in the last round. Hopefully he will be recovered by then. Let's join the drinks. Thank you.